Hey everybody, we are here and we're going to pick up where we left off last time in Acts chapter 9. We just saw Paul's conversion. We saw Paul joining himself to the disciples in Damascus, becoming part of their family. The text literally says something like, and he began to be with them, in the sense that his new life started with those people, not just that he began spending time with them, like his time with them started, but he himself kind of began with those disciples in Damascus. There's an interesting tidbit that Luke leaves out. I don't know why, other than the fact that it really doesn't seem important to what Luke is telling you. And when we think about a history, what do you expect to be written in a historical book? Like, what do you want a historian to do? If he says, I'm going to tell you all about the life of George Washington, what do you want that historian to do?
Put in dates,
And
facts,
and
what he did.
where do you want him to start?
Well, at the beginning,
And where do you want him to end?
when he dies.
And what do you want him to leave out?
Nothing.
Nothing. Right, right. That's because you are a well-trained Western thinker, a modern Western thinker. Ancient histories are not quite that exact. And when an ancient historical writer sits down to write something, like even in the Gospel of Luke, right? Luke says, I'm putting everything in order so that you can read it. And the idea of him writing everything down, he is doing that, and he is putting together a historical narrative according to the expectations of his day, right? An ancient historian, it was understood that they might combine elements from different events and put them together. You can see this in the different histories that are written about Caesar. Caesar, in some histories, says different things at two separate occasions. And then in another book, those two separate occasions will be merged into one. Well, did the historian make a mistake? No, not according to the way histories were written in the ancient world. He was giving you the information that was pertinent, and rather than tell you about two separate events, he could just throw all that together and tell you all at once. Well, historians also just left stuff out. That if it wasn't important to what they're telling you, then they will just leave things out. An example is if you compare the book of Acts over to the letter to Galatians, over in the end of chapter 1 and the beginning of chapter 2, Paul kind of recounts what he did at the beginning of his conversion, like when he became a Christian. And one of the things he tells you is that he says, from Damascus, I went out to Arabia. Right? Well, Luke leaves that out here in Acts. He just tells you Paul is in Damascus. He doesn't tell you that he goes to Arabia and comes back. And so when you start trying to take Acts and you start trying to line it up with the other books that are in the New Testament, it can be a little frustrating because Luke isn't necessarily telling you in Acts everything that Paul did. And over later in the letters that Paul is writing, Paul might actually reference something that Luke never talks about. Paul will mention over in 2 Corinthians that he was shipwrecked multiple times. How many shipwrecks does Luke have in the book of Acts?
Just the one, right?
Just one, right? But Paul will say multiple times. Paul says he is beaten multiple times, lashed multiple times. He's only stoned once. We do get that, right? That's in Acts. But all those other things, it happens a bunch, and you don't get every single time. And for me, that's kind of frustrating because you're like, Luke, what's the matter? Why are you leaving these things out? And Luke's response, if he were here, would be like, it wasn't important to the story I was telling. So he just leaves those things out. So here in Acts chapter 9, our story shifts from Paul to Peter, right, where we are now in the book. And people are uncertain about when Peter and Paul actually meet as brothers for the first time. Some people will suggest that it's here in Acts chapter 9. But interestingly enough, Luke doesn't tell us about that, and Luke doesn't have them in the same place at the same time here in Acts chapter 9. It's entirely possible that this is when they meet. It's entirely possible. But Luke doesn't tell us that. He does tell us that they meet, or seem to meet, in Acts chapter 11, and they definitely meet in Acts chapter 15. And so when you go back and you're trying to mesh all these different accounts together, it's kind of like taking the gospel accounts and trying to create an ordered timeline of Jesus' life. I mean, you can't do it, right? People have tried, but to take all these different accounts and mash them into one continuous story, it's very difficult because Matthew did not intend for you to do that when he wrote his gospel. He didn't intend for you to get out Mark and Luke and John and try and piece together the events. Matthew is telling a story, and Matthew expects you to follow his story and to get the points that he is making. Same thing with Mark and Luke and John. And John is just all over the place, right? I mean, he's just totally different than the other ones. But that's okay, because that's how history works in the ancient world. And so when you see these things and you're like, I don't know how all this fits together, don't get frustrated, because maybe they don't. Right? I mean, it might be intentional, right? The author is intentionally leaving things out. We're intentionally moving things together. And we might say, oh, well, you can't do that. But for them, it wasn't a big deal, right? They're still being honest, right? So when we look at the Bible and we say that the Bible is totally right? It has all these facts correct. I think that's a true statement, but you have to understand what you mean when you say that. The Bible doesn't tell things in a factually true way to the standard that I demand of it. It tells things in a factually true way to the standards that were in existence when it was written, right? And so a historian was at liberty to leave things out or put events together or do things like that. Right? And maybe today in a historical book, we wouldn't do that, right? We don't want to add to it. Like, we don't merge events together, right? We don't want to leave something out that might be important. We want to put everything in order in our writing today, but it's just different. And so when we get here in Acts chapter 9, there's kind of a jump, right, between Paul over in the end, verse 31, that section there when he is in Damascus, over into now Peter, who's going to be traveling around. So let's just take a look at our text, and we can see what we're talking about. So here we have Paul, and he's disputing with the Hellenists, and they're seeking to kill him, and so he's going to go to Caesarea, and then he's going off to Tarsus. And now there is peace all throughout Judea, right? So he was in Jerusalem, and then they're going to have to send him off. Well, when he's in Jerusalem, does he meet Peter?
Maybe.
Maybe. When Luke picks up telling you the story in verse 32, Luke is going to show you Peter not in Jerusalem. Now, I mean, he may have been at some point in time, but not in Luke's narrative, right? As far as Luke is telling you, Peter and Paul don't meet here. It doesn't mean they didn't. It just means that it's not important for Luke to tell you that right now. So Paul and Luke are they're talking about two totally different things. So again, if you're trying to make all these events mesh, and you have a hard time, that's okay. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, and sometimes the fact that they don't mesh is intentional according to the writers, right? Luke will leave out the trip to Damascus, for example, Arabia, for example. So, verse 32. Why don't you read for us? Just start in verse 32 and read down through verse 35.
Okay. Now as Peter went here and there among them all, he came down also to the saints who lived at Lydia. There he found a man named Aeneas, bedridden for 8 years, who was paralyzed.
I have to stop you. Aeneas.
Aeneas?
Aeneas. Aeneas. And the only reason why is because I like the Enid so much that you just, Aeneas. Okay, now do it again.
There he found a man named Aeneas, bedridden for 8 years, who was paralyzed. And Peter said to him, Aeneas, Jesus Christ heals you. Rise and make your bed. And immediately he rose. And all the residents of Lydia and Sharon saw him, and they turned to the Lord.
Okay, so we're going to stop right here and look at this event. And now when you look at it, the text there's not really a lot going on. You get Peter, he's going around all these different places. He comes down to the saints at Lydda. Why does he come down to the saints at Lydda when actually it's like northwest from Jerusalem? Like when we look at a map, we would say he went up to Lydda. But here in the text it says he went down to Lydda. Do you know why?
Because that's how people talk.
Yeah, it's colloquial, right? It's colloquial. It depends on what you mean by up or down. Like when we look at the map, we might talk about going up on the map. He means, Paul, or Luke means, he went down from Jerusalem, which is on a higher elevation. Yeah, so he's up in the mountains and he goes down to this other place, Lydda. Lydda is an important city. There are 10 provincial capitals in Judea. In the Roman province of Judea, there are 10 provincial capitals, and they each kind of have a little area jurisdiction. Like maybe a modern equivalent would be like counties in a state. And Lydda was the chief town in one of those places. in one of those places, right? And it is in the territory originally given to the tribe of Dan, and it is the plain of Sharon. So that's why at the bottom, verse 35, when all the residents of Lydda and Sharon saw him, there's this big plain, the plain of Sharon, and that's where Lydda is. And so it's not just the people in the city who are going to be affected by whatever it is that Peter does, it's this whole region of people that are going to be affected. All right, so when we're getting into this, we see Paul's conversion, and Paul's conversion is going to bring about a peace amongst the church, which may or may not be the reason why Peter is able to travel a little bit more freely. We don't know for sure. He may have been doing that anyway, right? I mean, he's serving the Lord. He might wind up getting killed for serving the Lord. But we see in Peter a change. He is transformed. He is converted to Christ. And now he is going around and he is following Jesus and he is being obedient to this call to be an apostle and to go wherever it is that the Lord calls him to go. And so one of the things, maybe one of the points that we need to make as we see this transition from Paul into Peter in the book of Acts is that the conversion of Saul, he's not Paul yet. The conversion of Saul was a very significant event. And it changed the lives of the people in the first century, right? The Christians in the first century. And one of the points maybe that we need to kind of emphasize, which we should already know it, is that Christianity doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? It's not like all these things were happening with the Christians without regard to everything else that is happening in the world. Right? There are a couple times in the book of Acts where Luke will mention an event, and then he will say, there's peace now for the saints, and the word of God, is spreading all over the place because now there's this peace. And actually, Paul will kind of mention that over in 1 Timothy chapter 2. That's one of the things we should be praying for, are times of peace where we are able to live a life in quiet godliness and we can share the gospel. And when Paul's conversion is one such event, like Paul is converted in chapter 9, or in chapter 9, we see with his conversion, and then it says, and then there was peace. Another instance is where Herod dies. Herod is going to put Peter to death, and Herod dies. He gives his speech, and he winds up getting eaten by worms. Gross. And then there's peace, right? And so these events, God uses certain events to bring about good things. And so when we think about the church, us today, living today, we don't live in a vacuum either. Our faith isn't present in a vacuum. And when we're watching these people in the first century, we're seeing how different events affect their lives, their livelihoods, their faith, and the spread of the gospel. And God takes advantage, right? God will use people when these events happen to bring about good things. We'll just take a brief pause to tell everybody who's joined us hello. Glad you're here. We're continuing. If you have your Bible with you, we're in Acts chapter 9. We're starting in verse 32 tonight, looking at the ministry. We're picking up again in the ministry of Peter, or the work of Peter as an apostle of Jesus. And so do you have any ideas or any thoughts about that, about how important it is that we see events happening and it affects Christianity? What does that tell us about God and his ability to control things, or the way that he kind of maybe works with the universe as a whole? Have you thought about that before?
Not really.
Should it give us encouragement to see these things? I agree. We're told that God can bring good from anything, right? God is able to work all things for good to those who love him. Right? The conversion of Paul brings good to the people who love the Lord. It's not a good thing for the Hebrew people, really bad, if all of a sudden your kind of champion now is converted to Christianity. If you are Herod, being eaten by worms is a really bad thing. But then again, for the saints, it's a good thing. And we see God consistently throughout the biblical text taking events, and for some people they're awful, and God is able to bring good out of them. Even for his people sometimes, right? People who are faithful to him, even sometimes they have to go through something that is terrible, but God is able to bring good out of it. Like Daniel and his friends being carried off to captivity. Not an enjoyable process, right? That was awful, but God brings good things out of it. And so we see that here in the biblical text. We see bad things happening, and then God able to change that situation or work and bring about good things. And now kind of maybe a warning or something we have to be careful of is we don't necessarily know what God is doing all the time. I mean, I don't have like a phone where I can call him and say, hey, what's going on? So we kind of, to some extent, have to guess, right? But if you have to guess, right, if something is happening and you are wondering, is this God? Is God somehow behind these things? Here's at least one way that you can know, right? And this is kind of a rule that I use in my life. I call it the good rule. If something happens and it's good, then I give God credit for it. Why do I do that?
Well, because God could be using it.
He could be.
And the Bible says that all good gifts come from God.
Yeah, exactly. So this is James chapter 1 on the screen, the text for James chapter 1. And we're in the middle of this discussion about people who are saying, oh, God is tempting me. God is making me do these bad things. Right? And people ask that all the time. Something awful happens and they say, why did God do this? And my answer when people ask me that question is, well, maybe God didn't do that. There are other people at work here besides the Lord. There's Satan and his angels. There are people who sin. And there is just death that now has come into the world because of sin. Right? And so those three players, they're active. They're doing things. But when we get to James chapter 1, James answers that by saying, every good and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow of change. Right? And that's the word for a sundial, how the shadow changes on a sundial.
So he's never going to stop using the good things.
Right. When there are good things that are coming, it is God who does those good things. God uses everything. He is able to use everything to bring about good. That is who God is. God is good. And when those good things happen, you can say, the Lord has done this. Now, does that mean that the Lord has providentially worked it out, where the Lord just knew all these things were going to happen? So he just made sure like the pieces were in the right place, and then as time happened, they just kind of fell into place. Is that how God did it? Maybe. Did God actively do something, like we see him actively working in the book of Acts? Did God actively do something to make this happen? Maybe. Right? I don't have to know that. I don't have to know whether the Lord did it providentially or if the Lord did it purposefully, or purposefully maybe isn't the right word, actively. I don't have to know that. All I have to know is that God is good. And when something good happens, it's God who has brought that out. And that really helps me to align my life so that I can see, right? Now there's this clearly drawn line where these bad things that are happening, that is Satan and sin and death. Those are the enemies. It's this fight that's happening. And when good things come, even in the middle of something bad, when something good is drawn out of something bad, I can say, here's God working today in my life, however he has done this. Whether he's done it providentially, whether there's through something that I don't know about, maybe I don't know what he's doing, but he has done this. And we shouldn't be afraid to say this good that has happened, God has brought this to be. Praise be to God. That is what you see God's faithful people doing throughout the text. And kind of an example, maybe the best example, of God bringing something good out of something awful is the crucifixion itself. Terrible thing. And God basically takes Satan's big attempt to stop Jesus and turns that into the moment when Jesus is triumphant, the crucifixion and the resurrection from the dead. And so that's kind of what we're talking about. When we see what we're going through now, there's a lot of bad things happening with the coronavirus, with our economy, with people being out of work and people being sick and all the things that are happening, right? It's not good, but God can bring good out of it. And the coronavirus is not a good thing, but God can draw the good things out of it. And the good things that come about because of this situation, that is our Lord working to bring about his will. So if you ever have a question, is God active in my life? Did something good happen? If it did, then yes, he is. And he will bring that good sometimes out of the deepest, darkest, worst places. He is capable of bringing good things out. That's the God we serve. That's how powerful and how strong he is. Any other ideas, thoughts?
No, that really sums it up really well.
Okay, then let's jump back over to Acts chapter 9. And so here we are again. This is Acts chapter 9, verse 32. one of the reasons why we paused here is this name Aeneas. Right? When this shows up, I don't think that it's staged or anything like that. I don't think that they found a man named Aeneas and they brought him in just so Luke could record it. But I think Luke records this particular person on purpose. Right? There were probably many people who Peter healed. I mean, maybe not. I mean, maybe it is just this one guy. But it seems like there would be many. Right? When Jesus went places that were bringing droves of people, I mean, just myriads of people to Jesus to be healed. Because there are so many things, we can't fix everything today, but there are so many things that we have developed, the medical technology or the pharmaceutical technology, to help us overcome many things that in the ancient world you just couldn't. Right? Vaccines are an amazing thing. Polio is something that you don't hear about very often anymore, thankfully, due to vaccines. Smallpox, things like that. And so there's just all these medical issues that for us, thankfully, have kind of become, in a sense, in the past. Right? Not totally. I mean, there's still things that we struggle with, but we can just imagine if you kind of move backwards as we see the things that are hindering our health getting smaller and smaller. If you kind of look at that backwards through history and you just look at the breadth of things that would have been present to harm individuals, all of a sudden you can understand why there may have been so many people who needed healing. Another example that Simon mentions as God bringing something good out of something bad is Joseph in Egypt being thrown into captivity, and God using that situation to save the Egyptians, as well as Joseph's family, and all the other people who came to buy grain from Egypt. So God saved many people, right? He brought something really good out of that bad situation. That's a good example.
It is.
Where were we? Oh yeah, the health stuff, right? So Aeneas is probably not the only guy that gets healed. So why does Luke just mention him? Why doesn't he say Aeneas and Carl and Ralph? I mean, why doesn't he name those guys?
Does Aeneas' name have a special meaning?
Yeah, it kind of does. It's a Roman name, a Greek name, a Greco-Roman name. Now we've covered all our bases, right? It is not a Hebrew name. And interestingly, when Peter comes down to Lydda, or Lud, you can call it Lud if you want. I think that's the Hebrew name, Lud. When he comes down to this city, and it says that he was there among the saints, these saints are Hebrew people. Right? It doesn't mean that they all have Hebrew names, like Stephen and Philip. Those are not Hebrew names, right? Stephen, Philip, Nicholas, all those people in Acts chapter. Barnabas is kind of Hebrew. Over in Acts chapter 6, where you get those 7 men who are selected. Barnabas, is that Hebrew? Yeah, son of encouragement. I think that's Hebrew. Barnabas, Jonah. Yeah, Hebrew.
Okay.
Yeah, so what we see is this guy is selected. He's probably Hebrew, right? But he's got a Greek name. And maybe the reason why this name is chosen is because there's a Roman poet by the name of Virgil, whose name means manliness, right? If you had to give your kid a name, there you go. It's like, my son, the man, right? We joke about, I'm the man, you're the man. Virgil is the man, right? There he is. Virile, virtue, all these ver words, virus, right? No, all these ver words, manliness, right? Strength. And that's Virgil, right? And Virgil is this poet, and he writes this epic poem called the Aeneid, and it is about the founding of Rome, right? It is the Genesis story of the Roman people, and in it there is this hero named Aeneas. Yeah, the Aeneid, A-E-N, Aeneas, right? Aeneas. And he's kind of a hero to these people. And so the fact that you have Peter come and heal this man with this name is significant in the text. Just like all the other things that happen throughout the biblical text, the details don't seem to be on accident, right? The writers record things on purpose. You get the 10 plagues in Egypt, and you don't get all the names of the Egyptian gods, but you can see that the Egyptian gods are powerless to stop the divinity that exists in Israel. The names of the people that God will use in various times, he'll even have their names change depending on what they are doing, whether they're faithful or unfaithful, right? And Gideon is an example of this. When Gideon is doing good things, right, he is referred to as what? When he tears down the altar of Baal, what is he called? Do you remember?
I'm trying to think. No, I don't remember.
You don't remember? Well, we'll look it up later, right? So he's called, right, the hewer. He tears down the altars, and then he'll be called that for a little bit, and then he goes back to being called Gideon, right? That shift in names is significant, right? So here we see this name. It's because this is, right, the founder, right? The person in the story about the beginning of the Roman people. Here he is. And he's powerless. He's weak. He can't leave his bed. And Jesus heals him. Right? So it's a very powerful foreshadowing image of, I think, the brokenness of Rome and the way that Christ is going to now come and heal all people. Right? I think that's what you have going on there. Why would he be recorded and not others? Aeneas is a very culturally significant name. Right? So immediately when Peter comes to him, he hasn't walked for 8 years. He's paralyzed. Peter comes to him and says, Aeneas, Peter heals you because Peter is awesome. Is that what he says?
No.
What does he say?
He says, let's see, Jesus Christ heals you, rise and make your bed.
Yeah, Jesus heals you, rise and make your bed. What does that tell us?
He's doing it in the name of Christ, with the power of God.
Okay. Why is that important?
Because it's giving the glory to God.
Yeah. Why is that important?
Because it's God's power.
And is Peter really important?
Not really.
Does Peter matter?
He's just the tool.
He is a servant. Yes, he is the tool. Now, it's kind of like a double-edged question. Is Peter significant?
Yes.
Yes, he is, right? He is a significant person in the biblical story that we have. But it isn't Peter that is significant. It is the Christ whom he serves. And everything that Peter does is significant because it is the Christ doing these things through him, all these miracles, all these things that he does. It's Jesus doing them through him, the Spirit doing them through Peter or with Peter. And when we think about us today, we might have a tendency to think that I do this and I do this and I do this and I do this. Therefore now I'm good because I'm doing all these things. Is that how that works?
Not really.
No, it's not how it should work. Right? Now we might think that way, but why are we even able to do the good things? How do we even know to do the good things?
Because God tells us.
Because God tells us these things, right? We've been studying 1 John on Sunday mornings, and John makes a big deal about this anointing that we receive as believers, and how you have all knowledge, right? He'll say that, and you've been taught all things, right? Well, does that mean that we're like super smart and we just have figured everything out? What does that mean? Why do we even have things to learn?
Because God made them for us.
Because God has made them for us, right? And this knowledge that we have of God isn't so much like me figuring this stuff out, but it is God who makes these things available, right? So even though I may be trying, I cannot. Hang on, we're missing our Bible. Let's transition. There we go. Even though I may be trying to learn things and see things, thanks, David, for letting me know about the Bible. It's only available because God makes it available. That's what I'm trying to say. So what else stands out to you in that text there?
It says all the residents of Lydia and Sharon saw him. So he must have been well known, I guess.
Yeah, well, he's been on his bed for 8 years, and he is, you would have to beg, right? And so people going by, they kind of see him and they get used to him. There are people in Nashville where you kind of get used to where they are in the city. And if you see them, you might help them repeatedly. You kind of get to know them some and hopefully, learn their name and talk to them and engage with them as a human being. But you just kind of get to know who they are because you tend to see them in the same place repeatedly. Sort of like the man over in the beginning in Acts chapter 3 who is at the temple, right? And people know who he is because he's always there. Probably the same thing with Aeneas. Now, we don't know why he is bedridden. We don't know what is going on, what would cause him to be in the situation that he is in. But people probably came to know him because they saw him often. And so all of a sudden now, when this guy that you have seen for years, who has been laying down and begging and he can't move, now he's gotten up and he's taken his bed and he's going all around. And, that would be pretty amazing.
Absolutely.
Right? And so that's what we're seeing. We're seeing people who witness something that is unbelievable and they turn to the Lord. Now, when we compare this maybe to some of the things that people will offer today as miracles, this is totally different. Right? There is nothing underhanded about this. There's no trick. He's somebody who's well known to the community. I went to a healing service one time, and the man who was conducting the healing service brought all these people in with him to heal. Well, I don't know who they are. I don't know if they're really, if what they're saying is true. I was not convinced. I just wasn't convinced. And so this is different. And at that same service, there was a young girl who had a broken arm, right? And she came forward to have her arm healed. And now when there was somebody from the community with something she was hurt, when she came to be healed, the man didn't heal her, but he planted the seed of healing. And in 6 weeks or so, she would get better. She probably got the same news from her doctor, right? And so it's just one of these things where when you look at these signs in the New Testament, the reason why Luke records this for you is not only, I think, because of the Aeneas undertone there, but because this is incredible, right? And there may have been other people who were sick, but this is somebody that everybody knew. And the result of this man being healed is that what happens?
Everyone finds out.
All the residents, right? All the residents, it says, of Lydda and Sharon saw him. And what was the result of that?
They all turned to the Lord.
They turn to the Lord. That's pretty cool. Yeah, that's pretty cool. Okay, so when we keep looking at what else is going on, now we're going to shift away from Aeneas to a woman named
Dorcas.
Or Tabitha, right? We have friends named Tabitha, but we don't have any friends named Dorcas, right? Interesting. It's funny how names, you get used to different sounds. Anyway, and so Tabitha and Dorcas both mean
graceful?
Gazelle. Yeah, kind of like graceful, like a gazelle. They're beautiful names, both of them, but one of them is much more pleasing to our ears as English speakers than the other. And so she is described as being a woman. What? How is she described?
Let's see. Full of good works and acts of charity.
Why is that important?
I don't know.
Why is it important that you know that she is full of these good works of acts and charity?
Because it's related to the story?
Yeah, she is who she ought to be, right? I don't like to say a true disciple, right? Because just because you're not full of good works of acts and charity, maybe you're growing, but she is an exemplary disciple, right? She is somebody who is what we ought to be. If somebody were to describe you, hopefully they could use that same sentence. That's Stephen. He's full of good works and acts of charity. Right? So that's what we ought to be. We ought to be people who are full of good works and acts of charity. That's just who we ought to be. Jerubbaal is the name. That's who we ought to be. And so now she has become ill and died. And they've washed her and they put her in an upper room. And since Lud is near Joppa, right, or Lydda, is near Joppa. They heard that Peter was in this other place, and so the saints in Joppa are going to send and bring Peter to them so that he can maybe do something, right? I don't know what they expected. Maybe they hoped that he could heal her or raise her from the dead, but they go and they send for him, and so Peter is there, and upon hearing, "Please come with us without delay," Peter rises and goes with him. And when he arrives, they take him to the upper room. And why don't you read for us in verse 39? Just read for us verse 39 down through the end of that account.
Okay. So Peter rose and went with them, and when he arrived, they took him to the upper room. All the windows stood beside widows. All the widows stood beside him, weeping and showing tunics and other garments that Dorcas made while she was with them. But Peter put them all outside and knelt down and prayed. And turning to the body, he said, "Tabitha, arise." And she opened her eyes, and when she saw Peter, she sat up. And he gave her his hand and raised her up. Then calling the saints and widows, he presented her alive. And it became known throughout all Joppa, and many believed in the Lord. And he stayed in Joppa for many days with one Simon, a tanner.
All right, that's going to be significant because this is where he's going to have his vision, and this is where he's going to ultimately be called by Cornelius, and you'll kind of get this in. And so what you're seeing is as Peter is traveling to Lud and then Joppa and then eventually off to meet with Cornelius in Caesarea, he is traveling further and further into the Gentile regions, right? I mean, he is being pulled out toward the Gentiles. And so there's this shift that is happening away from a Judeo-centric faith, right? All the Christians right now, with the possible exception of the man from Ethiopia and the Samaritans, right? They're kind of like halfway. And maybe the man from Ethiopia is a proselyte, which would have technically he would be considered an Israelite. But you kind of have all these Hebrew people who are Christians, and then you have sort of like these halfway markers, these people that are almost Gentile but not really. And now you're going to have full-blown Gentiles, right? Peter is about to bring these Gentiles in. And this is one of the significant things that the book of Acts highlights, is the inclusion of the Gentiles. I don't want to say it's the point of the book of Acts because it's not the only thing that is important to Luke, but it's one of the major points, is the Gentiles being included into this faith. And so this is a huge turning point, right? We're coming to this huge turning point in the text. And all of these things are preparing us for this because in these two events, as we'll see in just a second, Peter is mimicking Jesus in a good way. He's imitating Jesus. All right, so Peter arises and he goes with them, and the same thing will be said later when he goes with Cornelius, right? And so you have this neat parallel. The Hebrew believers send two people, and they go and they get Peter, and Peter goes with them, and then Cornelius is going to send two people, and Peter will go with them, and so it's just really neat that you see these parallels in these accounts. So he goes, and while he's there, he sees these good works and acts of charity that this woman has done. There are widows everywhere, and there are people who are showing all these things that she has done. Why is it significant that she helped widows?
Because they were among the most helpless people back then.
Yes. Jesus would say, to roughly paraphrase, don't help people who can help you back, right? You should be helping people who can't pay you back. That doesn't mean that you can't do kind things to your friends. It doesn't mean that you can't give your friend a gift, and it doesn't mean they can't give you one back. But if I give you something and you are a powerful person, and by powerful, all I mean is that you aren't totally dependent on other people, right? So when you're an adult and you're living your life and you have, extra things, right? If I give you a gift out of my surplus and you give me a gift out of your surplus, we have done something nice, but we haven't really done a good act, right? Or an act of charity. An act of charity, these good works and acts of charity, are when you do something for somebody who cannot pay you back. Right? You're not doing it even necessarily because of any affection, right? I love you, you're my son. Of course I would give you things, right? But what we're talking about is something different from that, right? Somebody that you don't know. Maybe somebody who hates you even. and you're going to do kindness to them. You're going to give them something, knowing that they may never give you anything in return. Right? Just the fact that you give somebody something doesn't mean they're not going to hate your guts anymore. Right? And so that's kind of what we're seeing. And here is this woman, Dorcas, who has made all these things for these widows. They can't pay her back. I mean, she is never going to be recompensed for her time or her materials or any of those things. It is absolutely done only for the good of these other people. And that is something that all Christians should be doing if we can. Right? Now, maybe these widows here, maybe they're believers, right? And they're in a situation where they can't do these things. Right? They're on the receiving end of that. In life, most people will find themselves in both of those places. Right? Sometimes we'll find ourselves with nothing and we need help. And maybe some other time we'll find ourselves with extra and we can help other people. There's no shame in receiving help. And there is no glory in giving help. Right? We are always servants and we are always doing what God has called us to do, to share from our surplus and to be grateful in our need to those who love us and take care of us because of the relationship we have with Jesus. So here we see that's what's going on. And Peter makes all these people leave. Why do you think he did that?
I don't know.
I don't know either. Who else made people leave?
Elijah.
Who else?
Jesus.
I think that's why. I don't know why they do that. I mean, I've read some different ideas, but they do. Right? They're like, this is not for you. You need to leave. You can see when we're done. Right? It's just interesting that that's what they do. And so it's almost like you have this pattern that has developed. When something amazing is going to happen, people get put out, or they're asked to leave. And it's almost like there are certain times where God reveals his glory in special ways, and only a few people get to see it, like on the mountain of transfiguration, like Moses in the cleft of the rock, like Moses on the mountain, right? And so there's all these different things where people can witness amazing things, like all of Israel saw God on the mountain, but only Moses was up there with him, right? And so there's stuff like that is going through, but here, in particular, I think you see Peter imitating Jesus. Everybody needs to leave, and he goes over, and what does he do to this woman?
He tells her to get up.
Yeah. He gave her his hand. He raised her. Or yes. He walks over to her. He turns to the body and he says, Tabitha, get up. Can you think of another person who said something very similar?
Jesus.
What did he say?
I can't think of the word in Hebrew, but basically, little girl, get up.
Yeah, Talitha Kumi. Talitha Kumi. Little girl, get up. Same thing here, except he didn't call Tabitha a little girl because she wasn't, right? And so it's the same thing, right? Little, get up. And she opened her eyes, and then Peter helps her up, and then everybody comes in, and they see her, and he's like, look, she's alive, and everybody's amazed, right? And so again, this is something that is absolutely amazing, and many people are going to come to believe in the Lord because they can see his power, right? I do not have the ability to perform signs and wonders like this. Right? I cannot raise people from the dead. At least it hasn't happened yet. Right? I cannot heal people who are paralyzed. I cannot do those things. But does that mean that I cannot show the power of the Lord in my life?
No.
So how do you go about doing that? Hey, Laura. How do you do that?
With the things you do every day, right?
It's the power of a transformed life, right? We should be so different that it's weird, right? And if the only thing different about my life is that I'm nice to people, there are lots of nice people. We are called to a sacrificial life, very much like you see here with Tabitha, right? She is sacrificing her life, her time, her materials, her possessions. She is sacrificing those things and giving them to others. And we have to be about that, right? This selfless life where when we have things, we use them to serve others. And it's going to look different depending on who you are or where you live and where you find yourself. The United States, Christians in the United States struggle with this idea because our country is so prosperous, right? We don't necessarily see poverty in the same way that other countries do, where there is such a huge divide between those who have and those who do not. right? I mean, some living conditions in other places are unbelievable, right? So in our country, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't still do that, right? But we struggle in our country because it is so prosperous. And so we have to be careful that we don't think that everybody else in the world is like this. And we should take care of the people that we see here. We should use the opportunities that we have here to help people. The greatest thing that we can do is love people so that we can show them Jesus, so that they can see this transformative power of Christ in us. That is what we want people to see, because that is what turns them, right? Not necessarily raising someone from the dead, although that'd be cool, right? But the change in me, my transformed life, is what shows people Christ. And that's why it's interesting that here we see Peter, he has become a parallel for Christ in these two stories with Aeneas and with Dorcas. We can see that he is this parallel of Jesus and the prophets. You mentioned the prophets. Yes, he even parallels the prophets. So let's look just very quickly over in Luke chapter 5. We've only got a couple minutes left. We're going to see a very similar account with Jesus. He's going to heal somebody who is paralyzed. And so there's this man, he can't walk. His friends get him and they lower him down into this house over in Luke chapter 5. And Jesus is going to tell the man the same thing that Peter says, right? And he's going to say, Peter doesn't say your sins are forgiven to Aeneas, but he says, hey, get up. And the man does, right? So he's going to turn to the paralyzed man. He said to the man who's paralyzed, rise up, pick up your bed and go home. That's basically what Peter says to Aeneas. And so here you have Jesus healing a paralytic, and Peter heals a paralytic. Then you have another account over in Luke chapter 7. Let's look at there. Right? Jesus is going to go into Nain, and there's this, the only son of this woman who has died, and he's going to go in, and he's going to say to the young man, get up. Right? And the dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him to his mother, just like Jesus gives, Tabitha back to these people, or Peter gives Tabitha back to these people. And the response is, God has visited his people. And the report spreads all over the place. Same thing with Peter, right? Oh, the Lord has come. Here he is. It's real. The kingdom is real. And so you see the same things. Also with the prophets. You're going to see the same things with the prophets, with Elijah and Elijah. Elijah and Elisha. And so it's just amazing that you see these parallels. And the message for us is that like Peter is here imitating Christ, that's our job too. Right? It doesn't mean that you have to go heal people. It doesn't mean that you have to raise the dead. But it does mean that you should be like Jesus. We see Peter out doing the things that Jesus did. Well, we should be out doing the things that Jesus did. Good works and acts of charity, which is what we see Dorcas doing, right? Or Tabitha doing. And so that's kind of where we're going to leave it tonight, is we see these people imitating Christ. And these two accounts, right? The account with Aeneas and the account with Tabitha, they form a pair, and they kind of validate the ministry or the work of the apostles. They are out doing the work of Jesus. And when we think about our lives, there should be something in our life that validates our discipleship. Right? We should have those things, the good works, acts of charity. That kind of is our indicator that, yes, my life has changed. Yes, I am who I ought to be. And we can see God then at work in our lives, not because he's performing miracles and doing all those amazing things, but because he is transforming us and changing us and making us into who we ought to be, which in a sense is even more amazing. That God is capable of shaping and molding human hearts and minds and wills into precisely what they ought to be. And that's just absolutely amazing. Anything else you want to add before we're done?
No, that was good.
Okay, that's where we'll leave it. We'll pick up next time in Acts chapter 10. And we're going to get to this crazy vision that Peter has. And we probably I don't know how far we'll get. So if you want to just go ahead and if you just want to read all of Acts chapter 10, we're going to cover it eventually anyway, but it doesn't make sense to like cut the story in half. So we'll try and cover as much as we can of that story. Yeah, we should be like Jesus is what we're seeing here. And we're going to see that everybody can be like Jesus with the story of Cornelius next week. Thank you so much for joining us. God bless you. I hope that things are going well for you. Looking forward to a time when we can be together again. If you're joining us online, we're going to keep doing this, so please feel welcome to come back and join us often. This is one of the good things, one of the blessings that has come out of this situation, is that we are able to connect and be with so many additional people, because now we have things now that we can reach out and connect with. And so in that, we can see God working and bringing out good things. Love you all very much. God bless you, and we'll see you next week.